Hi, this is Ann with Fully Thriving. I'm here with Dr. Clifford and Joyce Penner. Dr. Clifford is a clinical psychologist and Joyce Penner is a clinical nurse specialist. They are pioneers in the field of encouraging people of all faiths to connect with their sexual life and their belief system. They work as a team with individuals, with couples, within schools. They teach at special weekends for couples as well as in university lectures. And they've authored 11 books on this subject. So they are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for joining me.
We're glad to be here.
Yes,
this is going to be fun.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about how you got into being sex therapists.
Well, we certainly didn't grow up with the idea that we'd be sex therapists. We were both raised...
We didn't have that in our high school yearbook, that was our goal.
We wouldn't have even known there was such a thing. We both were raised as Mennonites. So we always think God had quite a sense of humor for calling us to be sex therapists.
That's amazing.
But so Joyce was a nursing professor at the university, Cal State University, and I was in private practice as a clinical psychologist. And I was asked to teach a group of 60 women subject of sexual adjustment in their marriage. And because it was going to be all women, I prevailed upon Joyce to come with me. And this was in 1975. And so we taught that first course.
Yes, a 10-week course every Wednesday night for a couple hours to these 60 women. And their lives were changed, which was surprising to us. We just kind of studied everything that was available each week and prepared what we could find, and it was very, very rewarding.
So that launched us, and then we were asked to write our first book, The Gift of Sex, which came out in '81, and then have written 10 more after that one over the last 40 years. So
wow, that's just amazing. So
yes.
So it's been over 45 years of doing this, is that right?
45 years ago.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is a long time. So
well, we're pretty old, you know.
Oh, you don't look it. You look just young and spry to me.
Well,
we feel pretty young.
We're both 78 at this point, so we haven't hit 80 yet.
Yeah, that's not old. So what have you learned about men, women, and sex and marriage in that 45 years?
Well, it really is interesting that through our clinical practice, as well as just studying the research that's out there, that we have identified certain patterns, certain things that work and don't work.
And one of the first things that we always emphasize is that if their sexual life is going to be good, it is going to depend on the man and the man's attitude. He's the one that will determine whether it goes well or not, because what we know is that a woman is most responsive when she feels cherished, adored, appreciated, loved, enjoyed. And when he can do that, then
it works for both of them, because he really has the key to her sexuality. And that key is affirmation and adoring and just accepting her where she is. And that's true. His role is so important, whether there is no problem, whether he has a problem, whether she has a problem. And it doesn't, I'm sure if men are tuned in with this, that doesn't seem fair, and it really isn't. But it is what works. And we believe it's what works because we as men and women are different.
We often use the analogy that a man sexually is very much like a stick shift Chevy pickup truck. You know, it's reliable, it's not all that exciting,
predictable,
but completely predictable. It always works. And for the woman, she's much more like a Maserati, where it's wonderful when everything is working well, but she needs regular fine tuning.
So we spend a lot of time in the shop and then we're really humming, but it takes a lot of adjustment. And that's why the man's role is so important. And it is true that we as women open up sexually when we feel connected, when we feel loved, when we feel good about ourselves, actually.
See, and that's one of the interesting differences, is that a man is most responsive when a woman is turned on, and a woman is most turned on when she feels good about herself.
And that's something men don't really understand, because usually doesn't have a whole lot to do with them. And we often say, man, a turned on woman is a turn on to a man, but a turned on man can feel like a pressure or demand to a woman. So she responds when he is connected with her and she feels loved.
Yeah.
That's when she opens up.
So the first thing we always emphasize is the importance of the man in terms of a long-standing, fully functioning sexual relationship over a lifetime.
But then her role is so important as well. It won't work if he adores, loves, and gets with her. It may not work if she isn't in a place where she can accept that she has a right to be sexual, that she's designed for more than just procreation, that her body is made to have sexual enjoyment and good feelings. And
the sexual relationship is as much about her enjoyment as it is his, because it has to be mutual if it's going to work, again, for a lifetime.
And the latest book we wrote is Enjoy, the Gift of Sexual Pleasure for Women. And that probably is our latest book because it is more complex, and
women are more complex.
Yes.
That Maserati and the fine tuning they need. They need a whole book to themselves.
Innuendos, and to write it all and make it make sense is much more difficult.
Oh, I bet. So is the book written to men and women, or just women?
It's written to women, and the man's book, The Married Guy's Guide to Great Sex, is written to men. But what we find works best is if a couple read the books out loud to each other. So in other words, even if they read a paragraph or a chapter in one book one week and then discuss that as they read, it's almost like having a counselor there, because it opens up communication that wouldn't happen and knowledge that goes with that fuels effective conversation. So they can read one book one night or 1 week and read the other one another, but it doesn't have to be a pressure to get through the book. Even just reading one paragraph may stimulate conversation.
Oh, I bet. That's a really great idea to have. It's like bringing you into their living room to have a little chat.
Well, and the other thing that goes on is a lot of times men especially, but women also, are uncomfortable even using the sexual words or don't know how to use them accurately. So when they're reading something, that kind of opens it up for them, and then they get practice at saying those words.
Or they may, excuse me, they may have had the same conversation many times and always get stuck at a certain point, or they each have their own almost script that they've repeated and repeated and repeated and never get beyond that. And what this helps get out of that mold and get a new script.
That's great.
Now, Joyce mentioned earlier that there's nothing that turns on a man more than a turned on woman. And when a woman gets that the biggest gift she can give the man is to get with her sexuality.
And
that's what makes him feel best about himself. That's what really works for both sides then, because then she has a good time and makes him feel like a man.
Now, often the man will say, I wish that's all I had to do, because that part is easy for him. But it can be as difficult for women to get with their sexuality and listen to their bodies and share it with him and enjoy his enjoyment of her and enjoy his body. And that can be as difficult for her as it is for the man to kind of have to relinquish his rights and get with her.
Okay, interesting. This is really interesting. So for many couples, the passion of their sex life kind of dissipates over the years. What do you do about that?
Well, what we know is that passionate beginning usually lasts anywhere from 12 to 24 months.
That's fueled by the dopamine hormone. That's that newness hormone when things are
the excited
exciting.
Hormone.
Yes.
And at that time, the shift has to be made into a relationship of commitment and attachment and intimacy, long-term issues, connection that need to be dealt with.
And that's fueled by the oxytocin hormone. And so, and that's several things we can do to help our brain produce that hormone. And one is looking into each other's eyes, because and that's why it's important when we have a newborn infant to look into the baby's eyes, because that helps produce oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. So, one thing we ask couples, when you talk to each other, do you look into each other's eyes?
And some cultures have more trouble with that than others, that it's almost wrong to look into each other's eyes. It especially Asian,
Something in some Asian groups.
in some Asian countries and ethnic groups. And so that's a whole new training that often has to happen. So,
yeah, and if they aren't used to looking into each other's eyes, we say play games with it, bug eyes. I'm going to really make it fun rather than, oh dear, now we've got to look into each other's eyes and it's so uncomfortable. Make it fun.
Yeah, the staring contest, right?
Yes, there you go.
yeah. So, I'm trying to remember what your question was.
Yeah, how to keep the passion.
Oh,
so
how to keep the passion.
One is to make that transition from the early excitement phase to the long-term attachment phase. The other thing is to focus on the enjoyment of each other, and the enjoyment, making sure that's mutual enjoyment, that it isn't one-sided, and make sure it isn't about the goals.
That's why we always talk about enjoying the pleasure of the sexual experience, or talk about pleasuring as the goal rather than arousal or orgasms or any measurable goal. Because what we know is that if both people are really experiencing the pleasure
and enjoying each
other, the arousal will happen. The orgasm will come. That's the way it works. But if it's focused on the goals, then that distracts.
And it's like falling asleep. Our sexual responses are controlled by our involuntary nervous system, just like falling asleep is. When we start watching that, when we spectator or stand outside and say, how am I doing? Is it happening?
Am I falling asleep or am I getting aroused? Either one.
Yeah.
That gets in the way of it.
Is it working?
Because anytime we try to manage an involuntary response, we alter it.
So we encourage, when a person is into that watching mode, to distract from it by keeping connected with eyes open during sex, keep the lights on, get active, go after, and focus on what feels good, not what works.
Okay.
And then a third thing we'd say about how to keep that passion alive throughout the marriage is that a couple needs to learn to move slowly in the sexual experience rather than speed it up and hurry toward the goal. And we often quote that song from the Pointer Sisters. It's
a very old song.
Old song, but it's a woman loves a man with the slow hands. Do you remember that song?
Yes, I do.
and that was talking about a sexual experience in that song, and that slow, gentle, connecting with each other pace is what can keep the spark alive.
So to summarize, it's making the transition from that initial excitement to long-term attachment. It's focusing on the enjoyment rather than the results, and it's making sure it's a mutually enjoyable experience. It isn't one-sided.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What I'm hearing is you're taking a lot of mental pressure off of the actual act of lovemaking.
Yes.
Exactly. And because when we put that pressure on ourselves, we actually reduce the likelihood of it working. And when we just get focused on the enjoyment
we try, the more we interfere.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So when you talk about transitioning to that stage, it conceptually completely makes sense to me.
Yeah.
What is that, a decision? Is that a commitment? What is it in actuality? Like, how do you do that?
Right. So in actuality, when couples will come and say, or one of them will say, I just don't think I love him anymore. I don't love her anymore.
I don't feel the passion.
I don't feel it doesn't, we used to really enjoy each other. Now we don't. And then we have to, when it has been carried by that dopamine, while even it's being carried by that dopamine, like when we do premarital counseling, we help the couple learn to kiss passionately, to make sure they keep kissing passionately, that they keep being intentional about their sex life, that they don't depend on just the feelings, but they learn to connect long term. And we have a formula for intimacy that we'll talk about as we're closing, that we
Okay.
want everybody to have. But that formula isn't a formula for sex. It is a formula for intimacy. And that's what that attachment phase is about. So learning, practicing habits that aren't just fueled by internal passion, but are fueled by keeping connected and making sure we take that time for each other. See, everything else in life we schedule. But
And we try to get to the goal as quickly as we can.
and we get rewarded. You know, the faster we achieve something, the more successful we are. Unfortunately, in bed, it's just the opposite. But we do need to set aside time for it, because otherwise it can just take the last thing of the day. You know, after the 11 o'clock news, he clicks the remote and turns over and she says, oh, I guess we're going to do it tonight. And it's 5 to 7 minutes. And that doesn't shift to attachment.
Right.
That doesn't keep passion going. That just becomes routine and boring and feels like you no longer have the love.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that while the dopamine is still high and you're basically high on drugs early in the marriage, you cultivate those habits that become part of the rhythms of your life that then continue to nurture your marriage.
Absolutely.
And if you didn't do that, you choose to cultivate those habits anyway, and those things will come with those new habits.
Yes, it's kind of like we don't want to live on chocolate all the time. We do have to have our vegetables and solid foods too.
Yes, yes. So now, what kind of things stand in the way of a mutually enjoyable?
Well, and this is a really important question, because what we know is that we've been describing it if everything is healthy and okay.
Right.
But not everybody comes into their marriage with all their junk having been dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most common areas that needs to be dealt with is if there's been any kind of violation or abuse in somebody's past.
Mm-hmm.
When that's been the case, then the sexual life won't necessarily just fall into place happily. They have to deal with that abuse first.
And they won't know that before marriage, because what we find is when there's been childhood or adolescent trauma, the person has high interest outside of marriage, before marriage. But once they get into marriage, it shuts down. And it's usually a surprise, both to the spouse and to the person who suffered the trauma. Because before marriage, he or she felt totally
Free and turned on and excited.
Really hungry for sex. Wow. And then it shuts down. And we understand that because the person now feels trapped, like they felt trapped in the abuse. Where outside of marriage, they feel free, like they can make the decision. And so if that happens or did happen, that's a time to seek some help.
Yeah, and that kind of help would not be thought of as sexual therapy, but the person dealing with those internal wounds and helping them heal from that trauma to move past that.
Trauma therapy.
So that they can then indeed connect.
Then another pattern that we find gets in the way, if we were raised in an alcoholic or emotionally out of control home. Because as kids, when we grow up, we need our parents to be stable so that we can bounce off the wall and find our place. But when our parents are either mentally ill or emotionally volatile or
alcoholics, whatever,
then we learn to internalize the need for control far too young. And when we get into sex, we don't like that feeling. When we lose ourselves during a sexual experience, it is the most out of control we ever get with another person. And that's scary. It's a feeling that we had as a child that we don't like. And so it isn't a passive lack of desire, it's actually a tenacious resistance. But once the person lets their body get turned on, then they can respond and have a great experience, and the spouse can't understand why they would fight that. They fight it because they don't even feel good about it afterwards. They don't like that feeling. So
one would be if there's been past trauma. Second would be if there has been alcohol or out of control home that they were raised in. A third would be, and this more commonly for men, but also for women, would be if they've got their sexual training from watching porn.
And gotten connected with pornography, which has two bad negative effects that make married sex difficult. The first is that porn is a constant dopamine high. And so they learn to respond to dopamine energy only. There's nothing intimate or committed about the person you see in the pornography. Right. So it's reacting to an external stimulus.
It's reacting to something that's flat rather than something that's flesh and blood and life and connected and the heart's beating.
Right. So the first thing is that. Then the other thing is that they learn a different type of sex than married sex. Mm-hmm. What they see on porn is not what married sex looks like. And then often the person who gives up porn, and more often the man than the woman, but sometimes it's the woman, he will want his wife, he's decided to give up porn now that he's married, but he will want his wife to do the things he saw in the pornography to get that same feeling. And then she ends up feeling like an object, and it's not mutual.
Inadequate, and she can't function that way because
it's not real.
A porn movie is a spliced acting event. It's not real life.
Right. And so those are the two things that interfere with people who come to marriage and have based it on pornography. And then another thing is when there's physical pain, or what sometimes unconsummated marriages, when the woman, usually this is for the woman's body isn't able to receive the man because the vagina is so tight it can't allow anything in.
It's a condition called vaginismus.
And it's very treatable.
We deal with it all the time.
But so many times couples never seek help. They're doing it more now that they can go on the internet, and we many times get calls because they find our contact information on the internet when they Google unable to have intercourse. But pain or inability to have intercourse will interfere with this, but it is treatable and correctable.
Okay. So what I'm hearing for the first few of those is that we're talking about things that would be more of an individual therapy. You know,
yes.
If you've had trauma,
Right.
Even if you had used porn previously,
right.
This would be kind of it. Now, this last piece you were talking about, is that something that is more physical, like a biological, or is that something that's relational?
It's usually biological or physiological,
right.
and has a physiological answer. Now, it does end up affecting the sexual life. If you think about, if a couple's been married for 3 years and haven't been able to consummate their marriage, it's obviously put stress on them.
Right.
So, but the physical part needs to be dealt with first, and then you can deal with all the stuff that came up between them because of what happened during those 3 years or 30 years, however long it went.
But sometimes we deal with them simultaneously. Like a woman, pelvic floor physical therapy is the best solution for the woman.
Okay.
And then, but she may by now, and the couple may also by now feel like, okay, now we have the solution to work on for her, but our situation is really tough.
Right.
Not always. Sometimes the couple has a great sex life, except for not being able to have entry. And then they don't need much sex therapy. They just need to correct the physical. But so many times everything has stopped because she feels like a failure. He feels frustrated. It's not mutual. It doesn't feel good. So it depends on the situation.
So then that would shift into sexual therapy, where we would be working with them as we do in other areas of sexual therapy.
Okay. Okay. Now, in your office, do you handle both issues?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
no, not the physical
we
therapy.
don't do the physical therapy.
No.
We send those to pelvic floor physical therapists.
And there is a website called pelvicpain.org where people can find, and also the I can't remember the site for the actual American Physical Therapy organization, but they can Google it, and they also can find it that way.
Great, super. So then you have a resource for our audience, right? You have a
Yes.
formula.
We call it the formula for intimacy, and we want to be clear, it's not a formula for sex. It's a formula for intimacy.
And what it is, the most important part of it is 15 minutes per day that we have the couple, and it's very prescriptive. They start by, they can set a timer. Sometimes we get them this.
See, men get nervous if the woman wants to start talking. He thinks it'll
or
never
maybe
end.
Sometimes it's the opposite.
You know,
Sometimes the
so
man's the talker.
we say, hey, don't get nervous about this. Just set the timer for 15 minutes, and when the 15 minutes are over, it's done. You're free.
Right.
Easier to get compliance, huh?
That's right.
And if they want to be very intentional, they can even set it for the first 5 minutes for just talking to each other, and that's sharing anything positive, not solving world issues, who they're going to vote for right now. That may have a lot of conflict in all couples, but an opportunity to look into each other's eyes, sit across from each other, or
and talk about something that is positive and affirming, either positive something from my day or something I feel about her, or anything that connects us.
A thought I had, I'd really like to do this in my next year, or anything that came to something I read, something, just keep it positive.
So we're talking about an emotional connection. Then the second thing and everybody is on a different place in their spiritual journey, but we recommend some kind of a spiritual connection. That could be a prayer, it could be reading a devotional, it could be reading a scripture, it could be just sharing some thoughts, but something that connects with the spiritual part of them.
And then end with the physical, and start that physical by standing up and giving a full front to front body hug.
20 seconds.
And the
minimum.
Research has shown that a 20-second hug gives a big surge of oxytocin. So in the woman especially. That's back to the connecting, the getting the attachment going. And that's so important for women, particularly women who have, or men who have difficulty with passionate kissing, which both men and women can have difficulty with passionate kissing, where they use a full mouth to really get into it. And when they feel that oxytocin and connection, they're more open to kissing. And then
see what the passionate kissing does, because we say then passionately kiss for 5 to 30 seconds, and that may seem like not much, but for couples that aren't doing anything, that's a lot.
And kissing not as a sign that they want to have sex tonight, but kissing for the sake of kissing and just getting into it and enjoying it and letting themselves melt into it.
And what we know about passionate kissing is that even for somebody that's been married like us for 57 years,
you can get a little spark of dopamine.
The dopamine
still
kicks off from kissing. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And so that's why we want the emotional connection, the spiritual connection, the oxytocin hugging connection, and then the dopamine kissing connection. So that's the 15 minutes a day.
And we just want to say, if anybody is watching this and kissing was a violation for that person, they may have to start with a second and just lip to lip, and then gradually take small steps toward kissing. And for that person, all these other steps will be very important. She's got to feel the attachment, the connection, the safety, and keep that going.
We say that because sometimes in a violation or an abuse, there was kissing involved that wasn't initiated by the victim, but by the perpetrator. And so then they're going to have more double.
Very negative.
So the first part of the formula for intimacy is that 15 minutes a day, then planning on one time a week, one evening a week or afternoon or some block of time.
When Cliff and I had kids at home, ours was always Friday lunch, because being in private practice, we could take off Friday afternoon. So our kids after school would happen to go to a friend's or something, and we would take off the Friday afternoon and have lunch at that time. Yeah.
So that was not just on Valentine's Day. And then that's the weekly thing. And then we suggest that a couple take one day every quarter that they just devote to their relationship, something that they do with each other.
If you have a newborn infant, you can't do this, but
Sure.
for couples that can, to take a half day or a more significant time to do some studying, some reading, some talking.
Or some event,
Yeah.
something they like to, and then at least once a year, devote a weekend to something that builds their marriage and their
A
intimacy.
marriage seminar, reading a book together, getting away together, whatever it is that works, or staying home and shipping the kids to the grandparents.
And we have this on a little card that is a formula for intimacy that we'd love to share with anyone that invites it. So
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And that's so, your formula is so simple. It
Yeah.
is step by step. And I can just imagine the transformation with those 15 minutes a day.
yes, people will often say, we can't believe it, but we've just only done this for 2 weeks now, and it really has made a difference
Change
in
a
marriage.
relationship.
In fact, when we'll do a whole weekend seminar with couples, and we say, if you do nothing else than this 15 minutes a day as a result of coming to this formula, we can guarantee it will change your relationship.
And if you find yourself resisting doing it because it feels too task oriented, just do overkill in terms of intentionality. You know, kind of
Plow your way into it.
blast through that resistance, because it's well worth it.
Yeah, and if they get stuck, they can always contact us on our website.
Yes, great. And then you said your weekends. How often do you have your weekend events?
Well, those we just do when we're invited. So
So
if
it
we're
varies.
invited to a
Mhm.
conference or a counseling center group or a church or a school or whatever, so that's just when we go and we're invited. So those we can share with them from our website also, which is
Okay.
passionatecommitment.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking time out with me tonight to talk about this. This is so valuable for our audience, and just
Great.
honored by your marriage, and then that you share what you've learned there with so many. Thank you.
We
love it.
love doing
Thank
this.
you.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity.
Yes.